In 1879, a woman named Clara Hensley on a homestead outside Dodge City, Kansas, fed a family of 9 on what she could pull from 40 acres of hard dirt and 1 cast-iron pot. Her youngest daughter later wrote that her mother cooked the same 7 meals in rotation for 6 years straight. There was nothing else to cook. That pot is number 8 on this list. Number 15 kept fur traders alive for months on nothing else. Number 3 was still being eaten on farms 60 years after the Civil War. These 25 meals were not recipes. They were survival systems built by people who grew what they ate and ate what they grew. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down 25 rugged homestead meals farm families actually ate to survive. Number 25, salt pork and beans. This was the backbone of the American frontier. A slab of salt pork dropped into a pot of dried navy beans and simmered for 4 hours over a wood fire until the beans turned creamy and the pork dissolved into the broth. That was the whole recipe. Salt pork cost 6 cents a pound in the 1860s. A bushel of dried beans cost $1 and lasted a family of 5 for a month. You did not need a recipe card. You needed a fireplace and a pot. Homesteaders from Maine to Montana ate this 3, sometimes 4 nights a week because the ingredients never spoiled. The beans kept in barrels. The pork kept in brine. A woman named Eliza Chambers in Wabash, Indiana, wrote in her diary in 1871 that her family ate salt pork and beans so often her children could smell it cooking before they crossed the yard, coming home from school. She did not apologize. She did not vary the recipe. She fed them. That was the job. Number 24, cornmeal mush. A cup of cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling water until it thickened into a porridge that stuck to the spoon and stuck to your ribs. That was breakfast on every homestead from the Appalachian foothills to the Kansas prairie. You ate it hot with milk or molasses if you had either. If you did not, you ate it plain and were glad for it. The leftover mush cooled in a pan, hardened into a slab, and got sliced and fried in bacon grease for supper. Nothing was wasted. A 50-pound sack of cornmeal cost $1.25 in 1880 and fed a family for 2 months. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about eating cornmeal mush so often during the hard winter of 1880 in De Smet, South Dakota, that the family ground wheat in a coffee mill just to have something different. But they went back to the mush. They always went back to the mush because it was cheap, it was filling, and you could make it with one hand while holding a baby with the other. Number 23, hardtack and gravy. The military called it sheet iron. Soldiers called it molar breakers. Farm families called it bread. Hardtack was flour, water, and a pinch of salt, baked until the moisture was gone, and the cracker could survive a year in a barrel without spoiling. During the Civil War, the Union Army issued 10 hardtack crackers per day to each soldier. After the war, those soldiers brought the recipe home, and their wives kept making it because flour was cheap, and the crackers lasted through winter when nothing else would. You soaked them in water or broth to soften them, then poured pan drippings or milk gravy over the top. A farm wife in Boone County, Missouri told a newspaper in 1893 that she kept a barrel of hardtack next to the stove from October to April. She called it her insurance policy, not against fire, against hunger. Number 22, Johnny cakes. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, and a hot griddle greased with lard. That was the recipe that fed the American frontier before wheat flour became affordable. Some historians believe the name came from journey cakes because travelers carried the dry mix in their saddlebags and cooked them over campfires at night. Others say it was a corruption of Shawnee cake, borrowed from the indigenous people who taught the settlers to survive on corn. Either way, by the 1840s, Johnny cakes were as common on homestead tables as dirt was on homestead floors. A family outside Springfield, Illinois, ate Johnny cakes with sorghum syrup for breakfast every morning for 3 years during a period when wheat was too expensive to buy. The father later said that the day he could afford a loaf of bread was the day his wife cried at the kitchen table, not from sadness, from relief. Number 21, venison stew. When the smokehouse was empty and the livestock was too valuable to slaughter, you picked up a rifle and walked into the woods. Venison stew was whatever a hunter brought home, dropped into a pot with potatoes, onions, and enough water to stretch it. No measuring, no timing beyond done enough to eat. In Kentucky and Tennessee, homesteaders depended on deer the way coastal families depended on fish. It was protein that cost nothing but time and a bullet. A good buck in 1870 yielded 80 to 100 pounds of meat. The back straps went to the table fresh. The rest got dried, smoked, or thrown into a stew pot with root vegetables from the cellar. Thomas Colley, a farmer near Pikeville, Kentucky, recorded in 1874 that his family ate venison in some form 200 days out of the year. The stew was not a recipe. It was a method. You cooked whatever you killed, with whatever you grew, until everyone was fed. Number 20. Sourdough biscuits. Before commercial yeast existed, every homestead kitchen kept a sourdough starter alive in a crock near the stove. The starter was a living thing, a paste of flour and water fermented by wild yeast captured from the air. Some starters were passed from mother to daughter for decades. You pulled off a piece, mixed it with flour and a little lard, shaped the dough into rounds, and baked them in a Dutch oven over coals. The biscuits rose without store-bought yeast, which did not become widely available until the 1870s. Before that, sourdough was the only way to make bread rise on a homestead. A woman in Bozeman, Montana, carried her sourdough starter 1,400 miles by wagon from Illinois in 1864. She wrapped the crock in blankets and checked it every night like a child. When a neighbor's starter died during a cold snap, she divided hers in two and gave half away. That was not charity. That was survival. Number 19. Potato and onion hash. 5 potatoes, 2 onions, a spoonful of bacon grease, a cast iron skillet. You diced everything, fried it until the edges went brown and crisp, and ate it straight from the pan. If you had an egg, you cracked it on top. If you did not, you ate it plain. This was the meal that homestead families ate when the pantry was down to almost nothing. Potatoes kept in root cellars through winter. Onions hung from the rafters and lasted for months. Together, they made a meal that filled your stomach and warmed your hands while you held the plate. A 10-pound sack of potatoes cost 15 cents in 1885. That sack made hash for 2 weeks. Farm wives in Iowa and Nebraska served this so often it did not even have a name. They just called it fried potatoes. But it was more than that. It was the meal that said the cellar is almost empty, but we are not beaten yet. Number 18. Rabbit and dumpling pot. A skinned rabbit, jointed and browned in a pot. Water added to cover. Root vegetables if available. Simmer for an hour, then drop spoonfuls of flour and lard dough into the bubbling broth. Cover and wait 15 minutes while the dumplings puffed up and absorbed the rabbit drippings into soft, savory pillows that dissolved on the tongue. Rabbit was the poor farmer's chicken. A single doe could produce 30 to 40 offspring per year, and they ate table scraps and garden waste. By the 1890s, nearly every homestead in the Ozarks kept a rabbit hutch behind the house. A dressed rabbit weighed about 3 pounds and fed a family of 4 with enough left for soup the next day. Martha Elkins, a widow near Joplin, Missouri, raised rabbits alone after her husband died in 1902 and fed her 3 children on rabbit and dumplings 4 nights a week for 6 years. The children later said they did not know they were poor until they went to school and learned that other families ate beef. This was not a meal born from choice. This was a meal born from a woman refusing to let her children go hungry. That refusal fed them. That refusal kept them together. And 60 years later, every one of those children still made rabbit and dumplings for Sunday dinner because it tasted like the woman who saved them. Number 17. Fried salt pork and milk gravy. Cut the salt pork into thick slices. Soak them in water for an hour to pull some of the brine out. Dredge the slices in flour and fry them in their own rendered fat until crisp and golden. Remove the pork, sprinkle flour into the drippings, stir in milk, and scrape the pan until a thick white gravy formed. Pour the gravy over biscuits or bread. Serve the fried pork on the side. That was the meal that Appalachian families called breakfast, lunch, and dinner depending on when they had time to make it. Salt pork was the only meat many mountain families could afford to keep year-round. A barrel of brine kept it edible for months without refrigeration. The gravy stretched one piece of meat into a meal for 6 because the drippings carried the flavor and the flour carried the substance. A farmer in Harlan County, Kentucky, fed his family this 5 mornings a week through the winter of 1891 and called it the best thing his wife ever cooked. She called it the only thing she had. Number 16, boiled cabbage and bacon. 1 head of cabbage, a few strips of bacon or a chunk of salt pork, a pot of water. That was a Tuesday night on a homestead in Wisconsin in 1875. You quartered the cabbage, dropped it into boiling water with the bacon, and let it simmer until the leaves turned silky and the pork fat perfumed the whole pot. The broth that remained was called pot liquor, and you drank it from a cup because it contained more nutrients than the vegetables themselves. A head of cabbage cost 3 cents in 1880. 3 cents bought dinner for a family of 7. German immigrant families in the upper Midwest grew rows of cabbage in their kitchen gardens and stored the heads in root cellars packed in straw. They ate cabbage boiled, fried, pickled as sauerkraut, and fermented in crocks. Nothing else from the garden stretched as far or lasted as long. For families who arrived in America with nothing but seed packets and cast iron, cabbage was not a vegetable. It was a promise that they would eat through winter. Number 15, bean porridge. Dried beans cooked for hours until they fell apart into a thick paste that you ate with a spoon like oatmeal. No meat, no seasoning beyond salt, just beans and water and time. This was the meal that fed homesteaders during the leanest stretches, the weeks when the smokehouse was bare and the garden had not come in yet. A pound of dried beans cost 4 cents in the 1870s and expanded into enough porridge to feed a family for 3 days. The nursery rhyme your children probably know, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old, was not a nursery rhyme. It was a description of actual life. Families kept the porridge pot going on the back of the stove for days, adding water and beans as the level dropped. The bottom of the pot tasted different from the top because the oldest beans had broken down completely while the newest ones still held their shape. Nobody cared. You ate it warm and went back to work. Number 14, corn pone. Cornmeal, water, salt, and a little bacon grease mixed into a stiff dough and baked on a flat stone near the fire or fried in a skillet. No eggs, no milk, no leavening. Corn pone was the bread of people who could not afford flour, which on the frontier cost twice as much as cornmeal through most of the 1800s. In the rural South, corn pone was eaten at every meal. You crumbled it into buttermilk for breakfast. You ate it alongside beans for dinner. You soaked it in pot liquor for supper. Abraham Lincoln grew up eating corn pone in a one-room cabin in Kentucky and later in Indiana. His stepmother Sarah baked it over an open fire in the hearth. It was one of the few foods from his childhood that Lincoln reportedly still craved as president. A 25-pound bag of cornmeal cost 40 cents in 1850. That bag made corn pone for a month. This was not bread in the way you think of bread. This was fuel, dense, gritty, filling, and completely without pretension. You ate it because it kept you standing long enough to finish the day. Number 13, squirrel stew. In the hardwood forests of the eastern frontier, squirrels were more plentiful than rabbits and easier to shoot. A practiced hunter could bag 6 in a morning and have enough meat for 2 days of stew. You skinned the squirrels, jointed them, and simmered the pieces in water with whatever was available: potatoes, wild onions, a handful of dried corn. The meat was lean and tasted like a darker, nuttier version of chicken. The 1870 Virginia Housewife Cookbook listed recipes for barbecued squirrel alongside instructions for roasting beef, treating it as an equal protein. That was not whimsy. That was reality. In Appalachian communities, squirrel hunting remained a primary food source well into the 1930s. Floyd Patterson, a farmer near Hazard, Kentucky, told a WPA interviewer in 1938 that his family had eaten squirrel stew every week for 40 years. He said it tasted better than store-bought chicken. He said his wife could stretch 4 squirrels into a pot that fed 8 people. He said you learned to shoot straight because your aim was the difference between eating and not eating. This was not sport. This was the grocery store. Number 12. Sorghum and cornbread. In the Appalachian Mountains, white sugar was a luxury most families saw once a year if they were fortunate. Sorghum syrup was the sweetener that replaced it. Farm families grew sorghum cane in their fields, harvested it in October, and pressed the stalks through a horse-drawn mill to extract the juice. The juice was boiled down in long copper pans over wood fires for hours until it reduced into a thick amber syrup with a flavor somewhere between molasses and honey. The whole community gathered for the sorghum stir-off, taking turns stirring the pans while children scraped the green foam from the surface and ate it like candy. A gallon of sorghum sweetened a family's meals for months. Poured over hot cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet, it was the closest thing to dessert most Homestead children ever knew. In Howell County, Missouri, sorghum making was a 4-day community event that lasted well into the 1940s. Families who could not afford sugar did not go without sweetness. They grew their own. Number 11. Pemmican. The Cree and Blackfoot peoples invented this centuries before European settlers arrived. They dried buffalo meat in the sun, pounded it into a powder, mixed it with rendered fat, and packed the mixture into rawhide bags. The result was a concentrated food that contained as much as 3,500 units of energy per pound and lasted for months without spoiling. Fur traders adopted pemmican in the 1700s, and it became the primary ration of the North American fur trade for over a century. By the 1840s, homesteaders on the northern plains were making their own versions with venison or elk, adding dried berries when available. A pound of pemmican could sustain a grown man through a full day of labor. Settlers heading west on the Oregon Trail packed it alongside hardtack and dried beans as insurance against an empty stomach. This was not a meal you sat down to enjoy. This was a meal you carried in your coat pocket and ate standing in a frozen field because stopping to cook meant losing daylight you could not afford to waste. Number 10. Smoked ham and root vegetables. Hog killing day was the most important day on the Homestead calendar. Families slaughtered 1 to 3 hogs in late November when the temperature dropped low enough to keep the meat from spoiling during processing. The hams were rubbed with salt and brown sugar, hung in the smokehouse, and smoked over hickory or apple wood for weeks until they were cured through. A properly smoked ham lasted until spring. When a farm wife needed to feed her family, she cut a thick slab from the ham, dropped it into a pot with turnips, carrots, and potatoes from the root cellar, and let the whole thing simmer until the vegetables absorbed the smoky richness of the pork. One ham fed a family of 6 for 2 months when you sliced it thin enough. Walter Jennings, a farmer near Lynchburg, Virginia, wrote in 1887 that the day they hung the hams in the smokehouse was the day his wife stopped worrying about winter. Not because the worry was gone, because the ham was there. Number 9. Lard biscuits and sausage. No butter, no milk. Just flour, lard, a pinch of baking soda, and enough water to bring the dough together. Farm wives rolled these biscuits out on flour-dusted tables every morning before the sun came up. They baked in a Dutch oven set over coals, and by the time the men came in from the morning chores, the biscuits were golden and steaming and served alongside sausage patties that the family had made themselves during hog killing season. The sausage was ground pork mixed with sage, salt, and red pepper, stuffed into casings or formed into patties and preserved in rendered lard inside stoneware crocks. A crock of sausage packed in lard lasted through winter without refrigeration. The lard sealed out the air and kept the meat from turning. This was the homestead breakfast that fueled 14-hour days of plowing, chopping, hauling, and building. You did not eat for pleasure. You ate to work, and you worked until dark because that is what the land demanded. Number 8. Chicken and pot liquor. A farm wife did not butcher a chicken lightly. A laying hen produced eggs every day, and eggs were currency. You traded them at the general store for flour, sugar, and coffee. So when a chicken finally went into the pot, it was because the bird had stopped laying, which meant it was old, which meant the meat was tough as saddle leather. The solution was time. You simmered that old hen for 3 to 4 hours in a covered pot with water, salt, and whatever herbs grew near the doorstep. The slow cooking broke down the connective tissue until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned rich and golden. The broth, the pot liquor, was the real prize. Farm families poured it over cornbread or drank it straight from a cup because it contained the concentrated nutrition of the entire bird. A family in rural Georgia in the 1890s kept a flock of 30 hens. The eggs went to the store. The spent hens went to the pot. And the pot liquor went to the children first because the mother knew that the broth held more nourishment than the meat. She was not a trained expert. She was a woman who watched her children grow strong on what other people would have called scraps. That observation, passed from mother to daughter across generations, was worth more than any cookbook. Modern science now confirms what those farm mothers already knew. Bone broth contains collagen, gelatin, and minerals drawn from the bones during hours of simmering. A cup of it provided more absorbable nutrition than a plate of vegetables. Those women did not need a laboratory to prove it. They had proof walking around their kitchen in muddy boots, growing an inch a summer on broth and cornbread. It was knowing without naming. It was the kind of intelligence that does not get written down because the people who possess it are too busy feeding their families to pick up a pen. They watched. They remembered. They kept the pot going. Number 7. Mush and milk. This was cornmeal mush served in a bowl with cold milk poured over it. That was the entire meal. No sugar, no fruit, no embellishment. You ate it for breakfast. Sometimes you ate it for supper too. The cornmeal gave you substance. The milk gave you protein and fat. Together they kept a family functioning through days that started at 4 in the morning and did not end until the animals were fed and the barn was closed after dark. In the 1880s, a quart of milk cost nothing if you owned a cow, and most homestead families did. The cow was often the most valuable thing on the property, more valuable than the house because the house did not produce food. A 50-pound sack of cornmeal and a dairy cow. That combination alone could keep a family alive for months. It was not nutrition in the modern sense. It was arithmetic. Food in, work out. Repeat until spring. Number 6. Turnip and pork bone soup. After the last of the smoked pork was eaten, the bones went into the soup pot. A farm wife dropped the bone into water with turnips from the root cellar and simmered the whole thing for hours until the turnips dissolved into a thin, pale broth flavored by whatever marrow the bone still held. Turnips were the vegetable that homesteaders grew when nothing else would take. They tolerated poor soil, cold weather, and neglect. A row of turnip seeds cost a penny and produced enough roots to fill a bushel basket. During the hard winter of 1886 in the Dakota Territory, families who had stored turnips in their cellars survived. Families who had not went hungry. Ida Brewster, a homesteader's wife near Huron, South Dakota, wrote to her sister that January that they had eaten turnip soup for 11 days straight. She did not complain. She wrote that the soup was thin, but the children were full, and that was all that mattered. The letter ended with a single line about the weather. She did not mention the turnips again. Number 5. Dutch oven bread. Before stoves reached the frontier, all bread was baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven nestled in the coals of the fireplace. You mixed flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter into a dough, let it rise overnight near the warm hearth, then lowered it into the greased Dutch oven and buried the pot in hot coals. An hour later, you pulled out a round loaf with a crust so thick you had to break it with your hands and an inside so warm and soft it steamed when you tore it apart. Paul Revere is credited with redesigning the Dutch oven in the 1700s, adding legs for stability over coals and a flanged lid to hold embers on top for even baking. That design did not change for 100 years because it did not need to. A Dutch oven bread cost nothing beyond the flour and the starter. It fed a family for 2 days. And the smell of it baking was the only thing that made a dirt floor cabin feel like a home. Number 4. Cracklings and greens. On hog killing day, the fat was trimmed from the carcass and cut into small cubes. Those cubes went into a large pot over a low fire and rendered slowly for hours. The liquid fat became lard, which was stored in crocks and used for cooking all year. The crispy bits left behind were cracklings, golden brown nuggets of fried pork fat that shattered between your teeth. Farm families ate cracklings with whatever greens they could find. In spring, that meant dandelion greens, poke salad, and wild mustard gathered from the fields. In summer, collards and turnip greens from the garden. The cracklings provided fat and salt. The greens provided vitamins that prevented scurvy, though no homesteader used that word. They just knew that eating greens kept you from getting sick. A single hog produced enough lard to last a year and enough cracklings to flavor a week of meals. Nothing was wasted. The fat cooked your food, the scraps of the fat fed your family, even the rendered remains had a purpose. Number 3. Oatmeal porridge with molasses. In the northern homesteads of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, oatmeal porridge was the meal that carried families through winters that lasted 5 months and dropped below zero for weeks at a time. A cup of oats boiled in water until thick. A spoonful of molasses stirred in for sweetness. That was breakfast every morning from November to March. A 50-pound sack of oats cost 90 cents in 1890 and lasted a family of 4 through the entire winter. Molasses cost 45 cents a gallon, under $2 for 3 months of breakfasts. Scandinavian immigrants in Minnesota ate porridge so often they had a name for the wooden paddle used to stir it. Norwegian families called it a grotspade. They carried them across the Atlantic alongside their Bibles and their bedding because a porridge paddle was considered as essential to survival as scripture. That was not sentimentality. That was a family telling you exactly what they believed would keep them alive in a new country. Number 2. Pinto beans and fatback. A pot of dried pinto beans simmered all day with a chunk of fatback, which was the layer of fat cut from the back of a hog and cured in salt. The fatback dissolved slowly into the beans, giving them a richness that made the pot taste like it contained real meat even when the fatback was the only animal product in the kitchen. Served over cornbread, this was the defining meal of the rural South, the Ozarks, and the Great Plains for over 100 years. A 2-pound bag of dried pinto beans cost 10 cents in the 1890s and fed a family of 5 for a week. The fatback cost a few pennies or nothing at all if you raised your own hogs. This was the cheapest complete protein available on the American homestead. The beans provided the amino acids. The fat provided the fuel. The cornbread provided the bulk. Together, they formed a meal so efficient that entire communities survived on almost nothing else during lean years. There was no presentation, no garnish, no name more creative than beans and cornbread. There was only a full pot and a family that would eat tonight and tomorrow and the day after that. Number 1. Chicken soup with garden vegetables. A whole chicken simmered in a pot of water with carrots, potatoes, onions, and whatever else the garden offered. This was the meal that homestead families reserved for the moments that mattered most. Sundays, births, deaths. The first real cold snap of autumn. The day a neighbor lost a barn to fire. You did not make chicken soup on a Tuesday. You made it when something needed healing or honoring. The chicken gave up its fat and collagen into the broth over 2 or 3 hours of slow simmering. The vegetables softened into the liquid until the whole pot tasted like the garden and the barnyard had merged into one warm, golden thing. Every homestead wife knew how to make this without a recipe because every homestead wife had watched her own mother make it. The knowledge moved from hand to hand, not from page to page. A whole chicken, a pot of water, whatever the earth provided. That was the formula. It did not change in 200 years because it did not need to. When you sat down to a bowl of chicken soup on a homestead, you were eating the same meal your great-grandmother ate and her great-grandmother before her. It connected you to every woman who had ever stood over a fire and fed a family with nothing but what she raised and what she grew. That connection was not sentimental. It was structural. It was the architecture of survival. Bread bag ironing solved the problem of wrinkled clothes without expensive spray starch or steam irons. Families saved waxed paper bags from store-bought bread, using them as pressing cloths when ironing delicate fabrics. The slight wax coating prevented scorching while allowing heat to smooth wrinkles. More importantly, Families learned to dampen clothes by sprinkling them with water, rolling them tightly, then storing them inside bread bags overnight. The sealed environment allowed moisture to distribute evenly throughout fabric, making ironing faster the next morning. Children often helped with sprinkling and rolling, learning household skills serving them throughout their lives. Some women sprinkled clothes Saturday night, letting them sit until Monday's ironing session. The bread bags were reused dozens of times before wearing out. This hack exemplified the Depression-era mindset that nothing should serve only one purpose when creativity could multiply value. Frugality reached extremes during the Great Depression, prompting homemakers to become amateur meat inspectors, carefully sniffing, trimming, and salvaging moldy or spoiled meat, hoping tonight's dinner wouldn't become tomorrow's medical emergency. While modern sensibilities cringe at the thought, families in dire poverty routinely carved away discolored portions, heavily seasoned questionable cuts, then cooked them at high temperatures to minimize risk, though the flavor sometimes left diners longing for less adventurous meals. Depression-era recipe books quietly hinted that spoiled meat could be resurrected by lengthy boiling or vinegar marinades, presumably on the theory that vinegar masked more sins than it absolved. Surprisingly, this wasn't entirely misguided. Boiling could neutralize some bacteria, though it did little to eliminate dangerous toxins already present. Eventually, as understanding of foodborne illnesses grew, health officials recognized consuming spoiled or moldy meat wasn't a test of toughness, but a genuine public health threat. Strict federal food safety regulations emerged, explicitly forbidding restaurants and stores from selling spoiled products and making it illegal to knowingly distribute unsafe meat. So the thing about Depression-era cooking was that it led people to places they never thought they'd go to. Previously, we actually discussed in detail how people started using all of the pig. What you probably didn't think was that this meant literally everything. Yes, even the feet. Pickled pig's feet were one of the best things to go for if we're talking about people who drew the short end of the stick during the Depression. Not all economic stress was equal. People that were living in urban hubs, especially the big-name states and cities, had it much better than local towns and rural populations that were struggling to keep going. These parts of the pig, often considered offal, were not sold at market rate prices, and usually were a lot cheaper than other cuts of meat. The thing with those cuts was that even if they were available, which they rarely were since they were also being rationed heavily, they'd leave quite a gap in your budget. Pickling the pig's feet with vinegar and taking advantage of its acidity meant that the meat lasted longer too, and that goes to show you how dedicated people were to getting as much use as they could out of everything they had. Newspaper insulation was one of the most widespread survival hacks families used when winter winds cut through thin walls. Families collected old newspapers from neighbors and churches, stuffing them between wall studs, under floorboards, and inside attic spaces to create barriers against the cold. The layered paper trapped air pockets that slowed heat loss remarkably well. Children helped by crumpling sheets into tight balls that fit snugly into cracks around windows and doors. Some families even lined their clothing with newspaper, tucking pages inside coats and wrapping feet before sliding into worn shoes. The rustling sound of paper-lined garments became familiar in schoolrooms across rural America. What made this hack valuable was its complete lack of cost. Newspapers that would otherwise burn gained new life as thermal protection. Mothers taught daughters this technique. Knowing resourcefulness meant survival when coal ran short. While city rats today might prompt a frantic call to pest control, desperate times during the Great Depression transformed these rodents from street menace to last resort protein. Eating rat meat wasn't common practice, but urban families facing starvation did indeed resort to capturing and cooking these widely detested animals. Rat meat required meticulous cleaning, soaking in brine or vinegar, and thorough cooking at high temperatures, usually roasted or simmered into stews heavily seasoned to disguise its origins. Historical accounts indicate that rat dinners emerged mostly from extreme necessity rather than culinary experimentation, with some cooks humorously admitting the biggest challenge was convincing diners it tasted almost like rabbit, provided they didn't think too hard about it. Naturally, health concerns arose from consuming urban rodents, notorious carriers of disease. Think plague and leptospirosis, conditions more serious than indigestion after Thanksgiving dinner. These legitimate dangers pushed health authorities to unequivocally declare rat meat illegal and unsafe, permanently closing down any possibility of a rat roast revival. Modern laws reflect clear public health priorities, strictly forbidding consumption of rodents, classifying them as dangerous vermin rather than viable food sources. Rendered fat soap kept families clean when store-bought bars cost money needed for food and rent. The process began by saving every scrap of animal fat from cooking: bacon grease, beef tallow, pork lard, storing it in crocks until enough accumulated. The fat was melted slowly, strained through cheesecloth, then combined with lye water made from hardwood ashes soaked in rainwater. This mixture was stirred for hours until it thickened, then poured into wooden molds to harden over several days. The resulting soap was harsh but effective, cutting through dirt with efficiency that commercial products rarely matched. Some women added garden herbs for fragrance. Soap-making day became a community event, with women pooling resources and sharing labor. This hack transformed waste into cleanliness, proving that self-sufficiency was possible even when everything else seemed impossible for struggling families. In cities struggling through the Great Depression, hungry families frequently turned to their local waterways for sustenance, pulling dinners straight from rivers that today would make even industrial chemists hesitate. Eating fish from polluted rivers wasn't exactly gourmet dining, but it was survival cooking at its most pragmatic. Catfish, carp, and perch were typically breaded, fried, or baked with onions and potatoes to mask muddy flavors, a method that probably made diners thankful the river's taste didn't seep through too strongly. Even back then, though, residents jokingly admitted their fish dinners had a hint of motor oil, hardly a selling point, but better than going hungry. Public health warnings of the era were minimal. Pollutants like mercury, PCBs, and industrial chemicals weren't widely understood yet, leaving fishermen blissfully unaware of their toxic supper. Eventually, environmental awareness and science caught up to common sense. By the 1970s, federal laws like the Clean Water Act drastically limited fishing in contaminated waters, explicitly labeling certain rivers off-limits due to severe health risks linked to cancer and neurological disorders. So, the thing about lard biscuits was that it was essentially too available. Lard's pretty much just rendered pig fat, if you weren't familiar. Sometimes, people use cooking fat to add flavor and texture to a dish, and it helps to really make it an overall more filling meal. Now, since most of the urbanization hadn't taken place yet in America yet, and there were still loads of rural areas to go around, lard biscuits became very common. They were far more affordable than butter or oil, which is what you would usually use for your cooking if you had some spare change you didn't need to hold on to. It became such a common element of Southern cooking that it also eventually just became a tradition that people associated with the region. It's now a deeply ingrained part of American culture. Historically, biscuits were a big part of the way people lived in the South during hard times of the Depression. Leavening agents were really just the most worrisome part of the entire haul. You get baking powder and baking soda, which helps a lot in making the biscuits rise. You want your cookies fluffy, after all, not chewy and soggy. Now, the people would usually cut lard into the dry stuff, such as the flour and baking powder. Since flour was a rarity, most people used all-purpose flour. The rest was just the typical biscuit process, really. They're a lot better than you'd think, but they did cause lots of health issues over time, too. String-saving collections became obsessive practices in households where every scrap held potential value. Families kept dedicated balls of saved string, winding together pieces from packages, feed sacks, and gifts until balls grew larger than softballs. This accumulated string served countless purposes: tying packages, mending clothes, securing garden plants to stakes, creating toys for children, hanging laundry when lines broke. Some families organized string by thickness, keeping separate balls for different purposes. Children learned to untie knots carefully rather than cutting, preserving maximum length for future use. The string ball often hung near the kitchen door, always accessible when need arose. What might seem like compulsive hoarding was actually practical wisdom. Purchasing new string represented money that could buy food instead. During the Great Depression, when pantry shelves often looked emptier than politicians' promises, resourceful cooks headed into the woods, turning nature's mystery produce into dinner. Unregulated foraged mushrooms became commonplace, not from gourmet preference, but simple necessity. Families plucked mushrooms indiscriminately, often without knowing a morel from a death cap, and tossed them confidently into stews or skillets, sautéing them with butter or bacon fat. Old cookbooks optimistically advised, "When in doubt, boil twice," a questionable method that unfortunately didn't neutralize deadly toxins. Despite countless accidental poisonings, mushroom foraging surged in popularity, with amateur gatherers picking anything remotely edible-looking, sometimes proving that bravery and culinary wisdom don't always go hand in hand. By the mid-20th century, authorities took action, heavily restricting mushroom foraging in public parks and forests. Today, selling wild foraged mushrooms without certification is outright illegal in many states, enforced through strict permitting systems intended to protect public health. Split pea cakes are another example of how often peas and beans were the saving grace of American households during the Depression. The best thing about these things was arguably how easy they were to make. All you had to do was boil them, which meant that lots of people could effectively use this recipe. Some of the Depression-era recipes straight up just don't apply to people who don't have certain kitchen appliances or ovens or a steady supply of electricity. Split peas were something everyone had, from urban areas to outskirts and rural ones. It also helped that split peas worked so well with the kinds of things people already had on hand. A binder, like all-purpose flour or some mashed potatoes, was also really helpful in holding the mix together. Plus, they went great with potatoes overall. The thing is, though, and this is really important in why people chose cakes over easier meals, is because people sorely missed sweets. Thanks to the Depression, basically any item that could be used for baking or even just for a change of taste wasn't something you'd ever find anymore. It was too expensive, too costly, and it meant that people never got the desserts they grew up with. That really dampened people's spirits all year round, and peas were common enough that people could spare some for a cake once a week. Dandelion coffee became the morning ritual for families who could no longer afford real coffee beans during the Depression's worst years. The process began by digging dandelion roots from yards and fields, plants growing everywhere without cost. These roots were scrubbed clean, chopped into small pieces, and roasted slowly in cast-iron pans until dark brown and brittle. Ground into powder using hand mills or pounded between stones, the roasted roots produced a surprisingly rich, earthy brew when steeped in boiling water. The taste carried hints of coffee's bitterness without caffeine, providing comfort on cold mornings when real coffee remained a distant luxury. Children often helped with harvesting, learning to identify the jagged leaves and deep taproots making the best substitute. Some families mixed dandelion with chicory root for deeper flavor. This hack kept morning traditions alive when store shelves might as well have been empty. Back in the days when supermarket shelves weren't exactly overflowing with choices, families found protein wherever they could, even if that meant looking up into backyard trees for their next meal. Squirrel stew. Yes, these fluffy critters, nowadays famous mostly for raiding bird feeders, were often simmered slowly with root vegetables, onions, and herbs until tender. Considered lean, flavorful, and surprisingly nutritious, squirrels were not only abundant but a staple meat source when grocery money was scarce during the Depression. Interestingly, cookbooks from the era recommended soaking squirrel meat overnight in salt water or vinegar to reduce its distinctive gamey taste, resulting in something remarkably close to chicken, though Grandma probably never admitted it wasn't chicken when company came by. Modern laws recognize squirrels as protected game animals, closely regulated to ensure ecological balance and disease control. After all, nothing ruins nostalgia faster than discovering dinner might have rabies. In Depression-era America, protein was at a premium, and butcher shops quietly began offering an unconventional choice to economically strained families. Now, you've heard of lots of kinds of different sandwiches, but a bean sandwich might be new even for us. What does it typically consist of? Well, You basically treat the beans as a spread here. The cooked beans often get mashed, and then they're mixed with seasonings and herbs to add a bit of an aromatic kick to them. Typically, people were using regional beans that were really easy to get. You know as well as I do that convenience runs in the blood of every American, my friend. Pinto beans, navy beans, and kidney beans were some of the most accessible kinds of beans around and were the easiest to get. Lots of hardship economically meant that people had no option but to rely on things like these for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but particularly breakfast. With lunch and dinner, you could still run a soup or some kind of stew and get away with it. But what did people do for breakfast? Butter and toast? Couldn't have worked. You were saving that bread for more filling options, and butter was expensive. Things like bean sandwiches were really helpful because they were a reliable go-to breakfast option that also had a lot of health benefits like protein and fiber. Vinegar cleaning solutions replaced expensive commercial products throughout Depression-era households. A single bottle of white vinegar diluted with water-cleaned windows, cut grease, sanitized surfaces, removed stains, and deodorized everything from outhouses to kitchens. Adding salt created paste perfect for scrubbing copper pots until they gleamed. Mixed with baking soda, vinegar cleared clogged drains and scoured stubborn buildup from ovens. The sharp smell became synonymous with cleanliness, filling homes on Saturday cleaning days when families prepared for Sunday visitors. Women kept bottles of diluted vinegar, tackling spills immediately. The acid killed mold and mildew, particularly valuable in damp basements where moisture encouraged growth. Some families added dried herbs to vinegar bottles, creating pleasantly scented solutions costing virtually nothing. This hack proved that expensive products offered little advantage over simple chemistry applied with elbow grease. When empty stomachs growled louder than consciences, desperate Depression-era families sometimes turned to stealing eggs from wild bird nests, transforming survival into a risky game of climbing trees and dodging angry mother birds. Children often undertook this daring pantry raid, carefully selecting nests perched high above the ground, collecting delicate eggs from robins, sparrows, or doves. These tiny eggs were either scrambled or fried, occasionally mixed into baked goods or cooked into miniature omelets, providing valuable protein at virtually no cost, except perhaps the occasional scratch or angry peck. Cookbooks didn't endorse nest raiding outright, but folklore and family recipes quietly suggested the eggs tasted richer and creamier than typical store-bought versions, perhaps flavored by adrenaline from evading dive-bombing parents. However, what began as a necessary measure evolved into a serious ecological threat as declining bird populations led to stringent protections. Under today's strict wildlife conservation laws, specifically the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, stealing wild eggs is explicitly illegal, punishable by substantial fines or even imprisonment. Crackling cornbread is a pretty traditional Southern dish that comes right out of the family cookbooks of this decade, so that should tell you something about how much grandmas loved it. Crackling cornbread sounds a lot more climactic than it really is, though, so let's go through what makes it so crackling. Basically, they're made with chicharrones, or otherwise known as pork cracklings. These are crispy fried bits of fat that were rendered when the pork was being cooked, and they most typically come from the fat back or the skin of a pig. Now, one bit of time-specific context that's really important here is that people were using every part of the pig they could back then. Crackling cornbread was another variation of that kind of mentality where people really wanted to not let anything go to waste, especially the pig. Why was the pig so special, though? Well, unlike chickens, ducks, and even beef, the pig was the only animal that had use outside of the plate, too. You could use its bones for broths, you could use its fat for cooking, you could get lard out of it. That's what made this animal so important. And that's why so many dishes like crackling cornbread came out of the South when pigs were commonly being consumed due to the shortage of other options. Cardboard shoe soles extended the life of worn footwear when replacement shoes were simply impossible to purchase. Families traced foot shapes onto sturdy cardboard from boxes, cutting precise insoles fitting inside shoes whose leather bottoms had worn through. Some households kept stacks of pre-cut insoles ready, knowing wet weather would dissolve one pair quickly. Children walked to school with cardboard between their feet and the ground, learning early that complaining changed nothing when resources were scarce. More skilled families layered cardboard with newspaper for durability, sometimes coating the bottom with melted wax for water resistance. The cardboard compressed throughout the day, requiring nightly replacement in many cases. What seemed like a temporary fix often became a permanent solution lasting months. This hack taught children that ingenuity could solve problems that money could not, a lesson shaping how an entire generation approached challenges. During the hardest days of the Great Depression, families discovered ways to use every bit of available food, including parts that modern cooks might discreetly discard, leading to dishes like blood soup made from chickens or pigs. This thick, savory stew was surprisingly popular, especially among immigrant communities where wasting animal parts was practically a sin. To prepare the soup, fresh blood was immediately whisked with vinegar to prevent clotting, then simmered slowly alongside onions, garlic, spices, and grains, yielding a protein-rich, iron-packed meal designed to stretch tight budgets further than your granddad's wallet on payday. Interestingly, similar dishes remain popular today in European cuisines like Polish czernina or Filipino dinuguan, suggesting Depression-era Americans weren't alone in turning blood into hearty comfort food. But as food safety awareness grew, authorities tightened regulations on dishes using animal blood, citing serious risks of pathogens like Salmonella or E. coli if improperly handled. Today, restaurants or commercial kitchens serving blood-based recipes require strict health inspections and special handling permits, meaning Grandma's favorite soup might now invite an unwanted visit from the health inspector. Salt pork and milk gravy is something that was European, both in tradition and concept. You might wonder how something like that ends up on a list of the most popular things to eat when you have no money, right? Well, that has to do with how communal the country became during the Depression. You've only grown up hearing the phrase, "love thy neighbor." These people? They lived a traumatizing decade following that to the letter. See, many people had to reach out to the communities that were present in America and learn new ways of cooking, new recipes, and new ways to save costs and stretch supplies to last longer. That's how dishes like these started to become popular. The idea of salting your pork was something that people took to immediately because of how much it helped to preserve food, and this was doubly true for places that never ever had any source of preservation or where meat was hard to come by. Lots of people made do with the ingredients they had on hand, but as far as peasant food went, this was one of the more versatile and filling options to go for. Potato water starch gave families crisp, pressed clothing without spending money on commercial products. After boiling potatoes for dinner, the cloudy cooking water was saved and strained into jars. This starchy liquid, sprinkled onto fabric before ironing, created the same crisp finish that expensive store-bought starch provided. Shirts emerged with sharp collars, dresses with structured pleats, and tablecloths with professional crispness. The technique required practice. Too much potato water left fabric stiff, while too little failed to provide adequate body. Women learned to test concentration by feel, adjusting based on the weight of different fabrics. Some families kept potato water in ice boxes, though most used it fresh within a day before it soured. Sunday mornings often began with the smell of heated irons pressing starch into church clothes. This hack represented determination to maintain dignity even when poverty threatened to strip away pride. Imagine rummaging through a pantry full of unlabeled jars, playing culinary roulette with tonight's dinner. Exactly what many Depression-era families did with canned goods without expiration dates or labels. Back then, home canning wasn't just tradition, it was an absolute lifeline, with families routinely sealing meat, vegetables, and fruits inside recycled glass jars or tins, blissfully unconcerned about pesky details like expiration dates or ingredient lists. Dinner often became a surprise mystery meat special. Moms called it creativity. Kids might have called it something else entirely. Cooks would boil these unlabeled contents vigorously, hoping to reduce health risks, though botulism remained a lurking threat even then. Ironically, food safety guidelines of that era were minimal at best, and illnesses frequently resulted from guesswork gone wrong. Eventually, federal food labeling laws and regulations emerged, driven by serious health scares linked directly to unidentified canned goods. Today, selling unlabeled or undated food isn't just unsafe, it's explicitly illegal, with strict FDA requirements on labeling and freshness dates designed to prevent illness and confusion alike. Have you ever heard about coffee soup? Sounds like a fever dream, right? Yet that's exactly what it is. A soup made with coffee. As offensive to your familiar taste buds as that sounds, hear me out. You take some coffee, scraps of bread, and sometimes mineral or brown sugar and milk, and then you'd brew the coffee. Then you'd mix in those pieces of bread in the hot coffee and add whatever sweeteners and spices you had, and that was pretty much that. They call it a soup, but in practice it's more like coffee with extra steps, really. Still, it was a far better use of your cup of joe than just drinking it plainly. This way, you could get carbs in the form of bread, some much-needed glucose from sugar to help keep your brain running, you got your daily hit of caffeine, and the spices would help keep you active. People didn't look at food the same way we did back then, which is why some of these dishes might seem really outlandish to you. We look at food and think about pleasure, fulfillment, and what suits our tastes. They'd look at food and think about sustenance and practicality. How much can we get out of this? What can we get out of this? That kind of thinking led to people trying things we'd never think of today. Flour sack clothing transformed humble cotton bags into dresses, shirts, curtains, and quilts that clothed entire families through the darkest Depression years. Manufacturers eventually printed colorful patterns on their sacks, knowing housewives chose brands based on fabric designs they could repurpose. Women purchased flour based on matching patterns, collecting enough sacks to create coordinated outfits. The cotton was surprisingly soft after washing, often more comfortable than store-bought fabric costing far more than families could afford. Grandmothers taught younger women to remove printed labels by soaking sacks in lye water, scrubbing until cotton emerged clean and ready for cutting. A single 100-pound flour sack yielded enough material for a child's dress or 2 dish towels. The stitching required skill, but seeing children clothed in bright fabric made the work worthwhile. This hack represented dignity maintained through creativity when everything else seemed to crumble. Horse meat. Marketed discreetly as an affordable alternative to beef, horse meat steaks, sausages, and roasts made regular appearances on dinner tables. Recipes often called for marinating the meat overnight to tenderize its notoriously tougher texture, while seasoning with garlic, bay leaves, and red wine could cleverly disguise its slightly sweeter, iron-rich taste. Interestingly, newspapers of the time published editorials praising horse meat's nutritional value, hoping to encourage skeptical diners to saddle up and give it a try. However, public acceptance faded rapidly after World War II, as horses transitioned fully from livestock status to beloved pets, sparking a cultural backlash against consuming an animal more commonly pictured pulling carts or carrying cowboys into sunsets. Today, slaughtering horses for food is banned nationwide, driven by both ethical concerns and potential contamination from medications given to animals not raised for consumption. The FDA classifies horses as companion animals, effectively shutting the stable door on commercial sale of horse meat. Fried bologna hash was a classic dish that got a lot of traction out of the middle of the 20th century. The dish was basically something that was insanely available in terms of ingredients. Bologna was a really easy-to-get processed meat, and it was often sold in these decently sized packages. It's always such a blessing when the company decides to, not skim off the top and actually give you a pretty generous package. Plus, bologna was quick, really quick. You opened the package it came in, then you just put in the rest of the stuff. Now, back then, people were mostly just relying on crops and vegetables they had grown on their own through their backyard gardens and rationing efforts. One of these was potatoes, which was honestly such a lifesaver. Onions were also something people added occasionally. As for the bologna itself, people would usually fry that until it was decently caramelized, and then they'd mix it in with potatoes for a starchy and savory aftertaste. The hash was something that people served on its own, or sometimes with, like, a fried egg. It really helped to add basic things like that because you were always getting less protein than you ideally should have. Lard medicinal treatments provided relief when doctor visits cost money families desperately needed for survival. Pure rendered lard served as the base for countless home remedies passed down through generations. Mixed with camphor and applied to chests, it loosened congestion and soothed coughs during winter illnesses. Rubbed into cracked, bleeding hands after hard labor, it softened skin and promoted healing. Combined with turpentine on flannel cloths, it created poultices drawing infection from wounds and relieving muscle aches. Mothers kept jars of medicated lard ready for emergencies, knowing professional care remained beyond reach. The fat's moisturizing properties made it effective for diaper rash, chapped lips, and dry scalp. Some families added herbs like eucalyptus for therapeutic effects. This hack kept families functional when illness threatened everything. The practice taught children that healing often came from kitchen cupboards. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. Not the pemmican, not the squirrel stew. Start with the potato and onion hash, or the bean porridge, or the Dutch oven bread if you have cast iron and a little patience. Then sit down at the table, not the couch. Use a real plate. Eat it slow. Because these meals were never about taste or technique or presentation. They were about a family sitting down together at the end of a day that tried to break them and deciding that they were going to eat, that they were going to keep going, that the land could take their comfort and their rest and their spare time, but it could not take the meal from the table. Tell me in the comments which one your family used to make. I want to know if the salt pork and beans people outnumber the cornmeal mush people. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother kept a sourdough starter alive like it was a member of the family. Because these were not just meals. They were the quiet daily proof that the people who built this country did it one pot, one fire, and one full belly at a time.